In today's video, I'm going to go over my thoughts on the most recent patch 6 for Baldur's Gate 3's early access. Please leave your thoughts below in the comments and also consider joining the Discord server and leaving them over on the early access channel that we have over there. It's pretty clear up to this point that Larian is listening to our feedback, and this is how we can help them make the best game possible. Without further ado, let's jump right in. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the rather substantial graphical overhaul that we got with this patch. And this goes for directional and volumetric lighting, the fresh color grading, new atmospheric scattering, and much more. Overall, I would say that this is a huge improvement, although not perfect, and I will get into that in just a minute. Many things do look noticeably much better with patch 6, and if we're talking about cinematics on the Nautiloid ship when the Cambion attacks the Mind Flayer, this particular clip stood out to me immensely when I saw it for the first time with this patch. The cinematics as a whole seem to have much more of that movie type feeling that really helps suck you into watching them, and a lot of this I think is due to the improved lighting. In character creation, I actually thought that the Mal Drow had a new face preset because of how good it looks now. Just take a look at his skin, you can see pores, dimples, and even small wrinkles in the lips. But then I realized it's still the old face model, but with the graphical update, faces seem to look much more realistic. When you're in the game itself, something that stood out to me was being able to actually see moisture on certain surfaces, such as on the Nautiloid ship and in the Underdark on the mushrooms. It was actually a really noticeable improvement, and it really adds to the realism of the world. I want to also quickly mention that the game seems to give off a darker feeling to it now, which I think many players did want, especially those coming from the original Baldur's Gate games. What I didn't like with the graphical overhaul was that many of the areas seemed to be oversaturated. The reds were perhaps a bit too red, and the greens a bit too vibrant. Some of the colors seemed to lose a bit of their realism because of this. Also, the lighting in many scenes to me felt more like a spotlight was being used as opposed to more natural lighting, and I would assume that many of these scenes are just not finished. With all that said though, I still think overall this was a big improvement from before, and Baldur's Gate 3 is now really starting to look like it's going to be a nice representation for what games can look like in the early 2020s. Before I move on, I should also point out, and this kind of goes along with the graphical update, is that the game runs a lot worse on my rig than it ever has before, and I know that I'm not alone in this regards. I was dropping down to 12 to 20 FPS in many of the fight scenes, and if this was any other game I would have likely turned it off and stopped playing. I tried changing the settings, messing with DLSS, etc., and nothing seemed to make it better. So I'm hoping for a hotfix in the near future, or maybe this has more to do with the new drivers for Nvidia, but whatever it is, I hope a solution is found soon. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to recommend this game to people who are wondering if now is the right time to jump into early access. Please share your experience with running patch 6 below in the comments. Oh, and one more thing, anything related to a tail, so a ponytail or a tiefling tail, seems to like to spaz the hell out with patch 6. It's an obvious issue that of course Larian knows about, but I want to make sure that everyone knows that currently the power of the ponytail cannot be contained by a mere mortal. Now let's talk about the change to the high ground rule, which is a pretty significant change. Patch 6 made it so that high ground now gives a +2 to your attack roll, as opposed to giving advantage. So advantage in Baldur's Gate 3 means you roll the die twice and the game will take the better result. Having advantage is very powerful, so essentially high ground positioning was nerfed a little bit with patch 6. Players who may be struggling with this game in terms of difficulty, as there are no difficulty levels implemented yet, did I say that word? May not like this nerf to the high ground because yes, it does make the game a bit more challenging. However, I do want to point out that a +2 high ground bonus is still absolutely worth pursuing. So high ground was nerfed, but not to the point of where it doesn't matter anymore. But some of you may ask, why nerf it at all? Well, giving out advantage too often or too easily takes away from some of the features, abilities, and spells that are designed to give advantage. If all you have to do is get on high ground to get advantage, then those other abilities and spells, and sometimes classes themselves, lose their significance because of a simple BG3 positioning rule. The easiest example I can give is actually a patch 6 example with the Wild Magic Sorcerer. Part of playing the Wild Mage is getting their class feature called Tides of Chaos. And Tides of Chaos, when activated, gives the Wild Sorcerer advantage. This is supposed to be a big deal, and it's a big part of this subclass design. With the old high ground rule, Tides of Chaos doesn't nearly matter as much for combat purposes, because players who understand positioning in this game will likely already have advantage 80+% of the time because of high ground. And I think it's fair to say that this game has a lot of high ground in it, so it's really not that hard to achieve. So overall, I do like this change. High ground still has significance with that +2, but advantage is now a much bigger deal when you're able to get it. And those features and spells that offer advantage have a real place in the game now. Before I move on from all this, all of you Astarion lovers and rogue players, this shouldn't actually affect your ability to use sneak ranged attacks that much, because the way you do it now is simply by hiding before taking your shot, and many times being on high ground itself allows for you to hide with no problem, and therefore you have advantage and you can do your sneak attacks. Another big change with patch 6 is that we now have more tactical agency when using melee and ranged combat, and this is through the new weapon actions. Before, all weapons in the game had just one special weapon-specific ability associated with them. Now with patch 6, some weapons will offer up to 3 weapon actions per weapon. The key word though is some weapons. From what I've noticed, the weapons that have 2 or 3 total weapon actions are the martial weapons, so not the simple weapons like daggers, maces, and clubs. A player also must be proficient in said weapon to be able to use the weapon actions. So this update is mostly going to benefit your more martial weapon focused classes, like the fighter, that tend to rely much more heavily on their use of weapons over magic. I feel like there may be some varying opinions on this weapon update, which is great. Let us know below how you feel. But I have to say that I am personally enjoying it. Finding and picking up new weapons is certainly more exciting now, and classes that rely on the use of their weapons over spells have some more agency. Larian says that they added these extra special weapon actions to give martial weapon users more freedom of choice when deciding how to execute an attack with their weapon. So we're not getting like crazy spells or abilities with our weapons. All of these new actions seem to be grounded and really make sense for each given weapon. These new actions can also only be used once per short rest, so you cannot spam them. Your weapon's regular attack will still be used the most. Now, it doesn't really make a ton of sense that you can only lacerate an enemy once per short rest, but I do think that these actions need to be limited to keep everything balanced, so I'm good with the short rest requirement as of now. I'll try to think of a better solution for that as time goes on. Now it's time to talk about the biggest part of patch 6, and that being the new area called Grimforge. And spoiler alert for those of you who have not played it yet, you'll be able to see chapter markers below to skip this section if you would like. Grimforge is amazing. Despite the horrible FPS that I got during a few of the scenes, and various bugs that I encountered, all of which will likely be fixed within the time frame to the next patch, this area gave me a lot of hope for Acts 2 and 3. Not only was it about 5 times larger than I expected, it was also just a lot of fun to explore every single inch of. This is definitely my favorite area up to this point in early access. And I'll also mention that it gave off a quite dark feeling, and that could be figurative and literal, which is something that I, as a player, really appreciated. We got to see new monsters, find new powerful items, craft new powerful items, meet new characters, and fight in what many would say was a pretty big boss fight. The Construct fight was a rather unique combat encounter compared to most other ones in the game, and it forced me to actually use the environment, in this case the Forge equipment, to get the kill. And this required trial and error and also great positioning to end up being successful with. Although this fight will likely be easy from here on out because I know how to do it now, I really enjoyed the combat encounter on my first couple attempts, and it makes me excited for the future combat encounters that we're going to see in this game. Looting the environment in Grimforge became quite enjoyable, and not only because you're looking for new special items, but you're also looking for molds for the forge. And on top of this, you have to find mithril ore. Even though this form of crafting was very simple at its core, it was rather enjoyable, and it added to my overall engagement in this particular area. As someone who doesn't really take part in a ton of crafting in games, I do hope that Larian continues to add a bit more into this department because it was fun, and like I said, it really did add to the engagement of the entire area. Player agency in Grimforge was also off the charts, as there's so many ways to handle situations, and this goes for combat and in dialogue. This gives early access even more replayability, and I'm very excited to head back to this area on a different tune. Next up is the mud and blood that your characters will start to accrue on their faces as their HP starts to go down. So during combat encounters and after combat encounters, as your character's HP starts to go down, or maybe a character is knocked, the more mud and blood is going to show on that particular character's faces. Now, I did test this out, and it has nothing to do with the time that you're running around in the game. It really has only to do with your character's hit points. Personally, I don't have a problem with this, and I've actually quite enjoyed watching it take place. It seems to add a little bit to the immersion, but I have seen multiple comments on some of my videos and even live streams where some people are saying that they don't like it, so maybe this is better off left as an optional setting. I'm not really sure. Let me know below how you feel about the blood and mud below in the comments. Other little improvements and additions that I enjoyed with patch 6 were concentration checks now being shown in a roll above characters' heads, and this is how most saving throws in the game are done, and it's nice to see it in combat encounters with concentration. We also can now see what enemies are concentrating on spells by looking at their portraits, which is a big quality of life improvement. I also noticed that you can now go to jail in the Druid's Grove and prison in the Goblin's Fortress. Just when you thought this game wouldn't have any more possible outcomes, now we get to go to jail. I thought this was a nice little added touch, and it was quite enjoyable. Just watch out for the exploding mushrooms. And there was of course a host of other small improvements and additions that were great, but they're not really worth going over in a lengthy video. And just when you thought I might forget the new orchestral music, well, I didn't, and I love it, so keep it coming, Larian. And that'll be it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for all of you that made it to the end. If you're wondering why I'm randomly wearing a hat, like I used to wear a hat all the time, it's because my webcam sucks, and sometimes it just goes through periods of time where its quality is horrible and I can't get the lighting the right way, and then my forehead has a huge flash on it and my skin looks pale and green, and it's just all sorts of problems. So I put on the hat, it gives me a little bit of shadow, and the quality overall looks a little bit better. I'm gonna get a real DSLR camera at some point in the future, so I'll get all of that fixed. But thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys and subscribe if you're new around here. Shit. What do I say? What do I say? Until next time.